Hello and welcome to the tutorial of setting up an IK forearm with a forearm twist. When people make a IK hand and arm solution, they tend to think that everything can be handled in only three bones: shoulder, elbow, and wrist. However, this is a problem because what happens at the top is that when you wave your hand, you have a very limited range of motion, and a majority of the motion that happens for the hand is this sort of waving motion, or clasping or cupping or patting motion, which means it goes forward in X, but the forearm does not necessarily go with it. The forearm, however, does go with the Y rotation. So if you hold your own elbow down on the desk and do kind of a screwdriver motion with your hand, you'll notice that as you look at the skin as it goes up the forearm, more and more of it is taken in control with the twisting of that wrist, that particular motion. However, your forearm does not move when you do kind of a come hither movement with your hand. So what we want to do is we want to have very specific controls, and trying to do it with one bone or chopping this bone in half doesn't work either, because the rotation here will be controlled by one thing, but the rotation here will be controlled by another aspect of the IK chain, and it throws Maya into a loop. And it has a really hard time understanding things. So that is actually not the way to do it. So what we're going to do is we're going to put an extra bone in here that simply exists to be the forearm rotation. So let's go into it now. First thing we want to do is we want to use, under skeleton, insert joints, and click on the elbow and drag it up. The reason we're doing this is because this extra bone still needs to reside along the same place that the other bones were, the other forearm bone was. Well, we've chopped this in half. You say we can't use this now. Well, we can. If you come in here to the outliner and double click on joint 1, and we'll call this forearm underscore joint, we can actually now take this and left click select on wrist joint, and then using your middle mouse button drag it up to elbow joint. Now be very careful when you do this. When you're dragging it over using the middle mouse button, notice that there are dotted lines delineating where you're going to be dropping it. Not just on top of something when it has this square, these little kind of broken line, dotted line square, but when it goes into a line, it means you're going to drop it there between things. So we want to come up here to elbow joint and drop it onto elbow joint. What that's going to do is create a separate connection for the elbow. So now we have the original forearm joint here, and we have wrist joint, and we're going to make a, we can go and we can now move the elbow joint, and we have this forearm joint coming off from the elbow joint, and we have the wrist joint up here at the top. So these are two separate things. The wrist joint is going to continue to have more hierarchy put onto it. So I frankly like to have it, and I'm going to move it up on top of, but not inside of, the forearm joint. So I'm currently reordering these things using the middle mouse button so that they're simply going to reside between elbow and forearm, which is why I'm going to drop it now while the dotted line is a line, not a square. And there I've simply kind of reordered how things are structured. So the next point is that we've got to grab everything and make sure that the axis of rotation are sorted out, because if we don't have things where there is at least one axis running down the length of the bone, you can get some really crazy rotations that, by virtue of simply trying to rotate the elbow, you can get rotations in everything from the X down to the Z, and you don't want that. You want simple and as clean a solution as possible. So the way to do this is to come up to display, go down to transform display, and with all the bones selected there, you can see on the right on the outliner, click on local rotation axis, and this actually will pop up all of the local axis rotations. And to sort them out, you again can come up here to skeleton, go to orient joints, and this is where you can set up your structure in case you want to grab things and kind of sort them out as far as the direction of how these rotation pivots are done to allow a very clean rotation. The way that I like to set this up, let me just reset the settings. The primary axis for me is X, the secondary axis is Y because that goes up, and then the secondary axis for all constraints or orientation is Y as well. So I usually hit apply, it sorts everything out. There's also that little script orient joint, which kind of does the same thing. It's pretty powerful. It kind of has it all in one setup as long as everything is the same. Currently, it should have X as the aim axis. Aim meaning it's aiming right down the length of the bone. The up axis, in this case, I want it to adhere to the world, so the up axis is Y. And I also want to make the world up direction Y. I don't want it to be X or Z, so I've put that in there. And this does basically the same thing. You also can hide the axis and show the axis with everything selected. That's a nice little touch. And you also can do a manual rotation tweak down here if you need to. So everything is pretty much set up for me to go into the IK and make this IK. So let's go ahead and do that. Under skeleton, come down to IK handle. Be very careful because at this point we don't want to just have your normal reset single chain solver. This is what it's set to in Maya by default. We actually want something a little more complex. Click on this and choose rotate plane solver. That gives us an added degree of control so that the middle of that IK joint actually looks at something. In other words, if you were to put your hands on your hips and then wiggle your elbow a bit while keeping your hands on your hips, that's the kind of control we want. And a single chain solver only rotates in one plane. This actually changes the plane while keeping the beginning shoulder and wrist in relatively the same place. So I'm going to click on the shoulder to begin, and then we're on the wrist to end it, and we have an IK setup now. The next thing to do, of course, is to create the constraints so that we can go in and test this. So I'm going to go up to NURBS primitive and bring in just your basic circle. That's the simplest bit of geometry you can ask for. I'm going to use the little trick of going in, pressing W for the hotkey of translate, and then holding down V for snap to vertex. You can see the icon, corresponding icon up here, kind of light up every time I touch this. In fact, sometimes people just automatically have this down by mistake. They don't know what's happened. This thing only snaps around these weird places like so. It's snapping onto a vertex. And they go, I can't seem to get off this particular option. Come up here, check your icons, make sure that the snap to points is off. When you do hold down the V key, it's just toggled until you let up the V key. So I'm going to hold it down until I pop it right in the middle of what seems that bone. And now I'm going to rotate this 90 degrees. I just give it a twist by hand to find out which axis I need to be rotating fully. And there we are. Now, not completely done. I want to modify this slightly further by scaling it down a bit. But more importantly, I want to come up here and under Modify, go to Freeze Transforms, because I want to make sure that this is the new default position for this constraint. Look at all these values I've put over here on the right. So with Translate, Rotate, and Scale set up, I don't care, it's not a joint, so I don't have that selected. I'm going to hit Apply, and it turns to 0, 0, 0, effectively saying that this is the new position for this particular constraint. So bring back up the outliner and take a look at this new control, because we want to rename this so that everything is nice and organized. The next thing you want to do is create two more, and you can do this by coming in and going to Edit and then Duplicate right here, or you can use the hotkey on the right of the Duplicate command, Control D. So I'm going to do that, and then I'm just going to press Control D again. So there we are. I've got two more constraints. One I'm going to rename into Hand Constraint, and the other one I'm going to rename into Shoulder Constraint, or Elbow Constraint. So the cut and paste, luckily, or the duplicate, also luckily copies the names, and since we don't need to type in the word constraint again, I'm going to move these down to where they make a little more sense as the constraints for what they do. The elbow constraint, I'm going to drag along the floor, holding down X, which adheres this to the grid until it looks pretty much like it's under the elbow, meaning I'm going to try to align that as best I can. And not perfectly, this is not an exact science at this point, but to try and line up the Y translation arrow in pretty much under where the elbow would be. And turn this 90 degrees as well, maybe scale it down a bit so that it doesn't look the same as the shoulder controller. Also, you have some really nice controls down here. You can come in and modify got some really nice controls to go with these that allow you to change the colors on them. You could change the colors by putting them in a layer, as we've done here with the mesh, as well as the joints. But if you don't want to have a million layers and you want to color things slightly differently, you have that option here. If you come up to Display, Wireframe Color, And if you simply click on one of these colors and apply, that is now this color. You can come down here and grab these, apply, and then last one, let's just color it that, apply as well. Make this a little brighter perhaps. So there we are. So now we've got, that's terrible, you don't see that at all. Okay, so now we've got these controllers and the elbow controller, the hand controller. In fact, the hand controller I want to make slightly different. So I'm going to right click on the object and go to Control Vertex. And at this point, just select every other vertice that I can. If these controls get in your way, you can simply press the minus key to shrink them down. And I'm going to grab every other one and then do a grand universal scale. So this thing looks a little more like a star. And go back to object mode, grab it, and then holding down the W key, holding down the V key, snap it up to the bone for the wrist. Could use a bit of a scaling to make it a little more readable from a distance. So this is the elbow control. I'm going to try to cycle through these different colors until I find one that I think is good. So we've got pretty much everything in place. We need to come in and grab the elbow and the hand control, wrist control, and make sure that we also freeze those transformations because this is the new default setup for those particular controls. And from here we're going to start doling out the controls to the constraints themselves. But first, you know what? These just are not visible enough for me, so I'm going to come up to display, go down to wireframe color again, and instead of index, I'm going to use RGB values, which allow me to click on the swatch and then choose something truly garish, but it will in no way be unmistakable and really let me see it from a distance, arguably from space. So here we go, and apply. There we are. Could I have done that just putting that in the layer? Yes, I could have, but this is also a tutorial I want people to see, and you can color these a little more creatively on your own. So let's bring up the outliner. And the shoulder constraint is something that when Maya has, when you're in the mode of trying to constrain things to Maya, remember it has a very particular way that it likes the order of operations to be selected. You want to first grab that which does the controlling, i.e. the puppet strings, and that which it controls. And at that point you can assign a constraint to it. I'm going to assign the parent constraint because it needs both a rotation and a translation. You can see the values are now locked out for the shoulder joint. They're being controlled by this constraint. And the same thing should go for the end of that IK handle. I'm going to, however, grab the hand constraint first, then the IK handle. And I'm going to do a different constraint here because this is a point constraint, which means it's only going to look at it for the translation value. The rotation value is sort of inconsequential because it's a point in space. Again, it doesn't really have a rotation value because it's not something that is calculating anything other than a position, a Cartesian coordinates in space. So there is no proper rotation value for that to be affixed to. Instead, we're going to come down here, open up the full hierarchy of the skeleton, and with the hand constraint selected, then Control Shift onto the wrist joint, and there we can do a orient constraint. Remember, in all these options, you want to maintain the offset and make sure that everything is selected when you want all of these axes to be controlled. So I can hit that, and this should now control the hand. You can even give that a little wiggle back and forth. Remember, we're not going to see any effect until we actually skin this. So let's move on to something that can give us kind of a visible validation before we go on and skin this object. So with the elbow constraint selected, I'm going to grab the IK handle, and we're going to do a third type of constraint here, very specific to the fact that when we made this IK handle, it was with a pole vector, and this allows you to actually now manipulate where the elbow looks at. You can see the slightest bit of change there in the elbow as I move this back and forth, which is wonderful. So we're set up to go. Let's now skin this, and to do so we're going to grab the top of the shoulder joint, arm mesh, go under skin, go to bind skin. The only maximum influences we want here are two. Make sure you're clicked on interactive, you've got joint hierarchy selected, and hit apply. So everything pretty much now should at least have a passing look like a proper arm. You can see, however, it's obviously got some weighting issues, and that's okay because we're going to be fixing those in a minute. Note that when we twist the arm right now, it does not seem to have any effect down the geometry of that arm. It's just kind of staying local to the wrist, and that's one of the first things we want to fix. However, take this moment to save your work. We've put enough into this, we don't want to lose it, so I will take a minute, pause the video, and do so. Please do so yourself. In fact, before you do so, you can simply zero out the constraints here for the hand, and boom, everything looks wonderful. It's back in its original kind of rigged position. So save it now. And saved. Wonderful. So let's now move to the second part of this, which is that we need to set up the wrist joint. The wrist joint is something that we need to have control just the Y rotation of the forearm, or I keep calling it Y rotation, the X rotation, because that's what's going down the bone. So the X rotation of this bone is what we want the forearm joint to control, and we need to make sure that this forearm joint, of course, only rotates its singular axis that we want, which is rotate X. So wrist joint is going to be something that rotates. We can actually, because when we rotate the wrist like so, that is the rotation value that we need to have copied over here to the forearm joint. So, in fact, one of the rotations you can do when you're animating is to go to gimbal when you rotate. This is more of an animator's trick. Gimbal rotation, and that actually tries to make things a little more simplistic. Rather than get all these crazy rotation values, you should get something a little cleaner on the wrist joint. So we only want to copy the rotate X when this is being, when this wrist constraint is being turned. The only real rotate we care about is rotate X. So let's grab the forearm joint, go to its rotate X value, select it, and then come up here to Windows, go down to Animation Editors, and then the very bottom you've got Expression Editor. So this is not just the object you've selected, but all of its different channels that are currently keyable, and the only one we care about is rotate X. So click on the object as well as the value we're looking for, and it gives it to you here right in Mel Speak at the bottom. So you can control copy that and then control paste it, and you're going to tell Maya that you want that rotation value, and hit paste again, to correspond exactly to the wrist joint's rotate X value. So what I've said here is just make the forearm joint rotate X value match exactly the wrist joint rotate X value. When I create it, you should see a little color pop in here, meaning that this particular channel is now being controlled. And it does. In fact, we also have a rotation value already jump in there. So let's see what this does when we continue rotating. It's a little hinky, but that's okay because we're going to assign some more values to it as far as the weighting. And then we can also continue to mess with the editor so that we can maybe even take that value down to maybe half of the wrist. So let's go in and do some real fast assigning of weights. What I like to do is I like to click on this icon up here, which is select by component type. It allows me to come in and grab just a ring, and it says no problem, here's your ring, without even getting into the irritating selection of joints first. Just for the purposes of this, I want to rotate it, let's say negative 45 degrees. Put a little twist on it, we can see the effect of our weighting a little better. So back into component mode. There we are. Windows, I want to go from the general editors down to component editor because I want to delineate the exact numbers and values to the bones. I don't want to leave that up to chance. This is good because it's kind of the first step for accuracy of delegation of numbers, but it allows you This is nice for the accuracy of delineating by hand exact numbers of influence per circle of vertices or groups of vertices, and you can smooth that over later with the paint tools until it looks good. That's fine, but right now I want to check that at the elbow joint. It's got half the values given to the elbow and the other half given to the shoulder, and that's perfect. By the way, one of the options that I like to turn off when doing this is to hide 0 columns. That's on by default, which means that Maya is only going to show you the bones that currently affect whatever vertices you've selected, which is pretty nice. When you turn this off, it shows you all the bones in that entire hierarchy. Now this is good for what we want to do, as we have basically a 4-bone arm, but it can be dizzying when you have an entire character's bone range running the length of this option window, and you're sitting here scrolling back and forth just to find what you're looking, what it is you want. So with this open, I can now grab the second ring of vertexes, and I see that shoulder has nothing, wrist has nothing, and the forearm and the elbow are the ones sharing that, which is okay for now. But I want to come in and lock these off because I don't want them to get any values by mistake when I start squeezing them out between these two bones. And that's going to allow me, let's say, real quick visuals here. If I want to split the distance between the beginning of that particular bone and the end, I'd say these two ringlets are about, let's say, 33%, 66%, and then 100%. So this ringlet here would be the forearm joint controls that around 33% or 34%, and that should pop the remainder of that decimal number over here, which is 0.66, and it does. Then I move to the next ring, and I can do the same thing here with the forearm joint now controlling 0.66, and that should pop 0.34 over here because it's the only elbow joint that is currently allowed to get any values. Now that means squeezed values. I can grab the whole of this hand and wrist and quickly go in and just say I want the wrist to control 100% of it. So I'm going to grab all this and just type in 1. I'm allowed to do that. That is, the off and on hold has no problem with the user typing in values. It just does not allow values to get squeezed and then put into other places according to Maya's decision-making process, because you've got the hold on these. I'm going to take the hold off, and let's take a look at the twist that we've just created. Also, right now might be a good time to save your work. So let's save scene as, and I'm going to come in here and just name it Mesh 2. All right. So, with our cool little new arm rig, back in object mode, goes up and down pretty well, handles rotations okay, like so. And now we have that forearm twist as well. So let's zero this out so maybe we can see a little more clearly. Does this need some more work? Absolutely. You don't want to exceed that value. That's something we need to keep in mind. You can actually limit the bone values that you use. You shouldn't have to. You can actually limit the rotations that you are utilizing. But be aware that Maya still has problems with gimbal lock at a certain point, which is it flips things over 360 degrees. But this is pretty good for now. We've got the forearm skin going up and down. We get the forearm skin sort of twisting gradually, and we are allowed to twist, although we obviously have some sort of breaking points. We are allowed to twist this arm and this hand in separate directions, and it doesn't break too badly. So that's your basic setup for an IK hand with the forearm twist. If you have any questions, let me know.